This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.
Rodion Raskolnikov, a former student in St. Petersburg, had developed a controversial theory. He believed that extraordinary individuals had the right to commit crimes for the greater good of society. The suffocating air in Raskolnikov's cramped room clung to him like a second skin, heavy with the stench of poverty and despair. Peeling wallpaper curled away from the walls, revealing the decay beneath, a fitting metaphor for the young man's deteriorating mental state. Weak sunlight struggled through the grimy window, casting sickly shadows across the bare floorboards, where dust motes danced in the stagnant air. In this prison of his own making, Raskolnikov's mind churned relentlessly. His theory, once an academic exercise, now consumed him like a fever. Each passing moment brought fresh justifications, warping his perception of right and wrong until the line between them blurred beyond recognition. Outside, St. Petersburg pulsed with life. The clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones and the chatter of passers-by filtered through the thin walls, a constant reminder of the world Raskolnikov had withdrawn from. He had become a ghost, haunting the fringes of society, too consumed by his inner turmoil to engage with the living. The sound of footsteps in the hallway sent a jolt of panic through Raskolnikov's body. His heart raced, palms slick with sweat as he held his breath, praying his landlady, Praskovya Pavlovna, would pass by without knocking. The mounting debt weighed on him like a physical presence, each unpaid ruble another link in the chain of his desperation. Driven by this desperation, Raskolnikov found himself pushing open the creaking door of the pawnbroker's shop. The musty smell of forgotten treasures and broken dreams assaulted his senses. In his pocket, his father's silver watch seemed to burn against his thigh, a constant reminder of what he was about to sacrifice. Alyona Ivanovna, the elderly pawnbroker, fixed him with rheumy eyes that seemed to pierce through his very soul. Her bony fingers curled around the watch like gnarled tree roots, assessing its value with cold efficiency. The transaction was over in moments, leaving Raskolnikov with a handful of coins that felt like blood money in his palm. But it was what he overheard that day that would set his fate in motion. Hushed voices drifted from the back room, speaking of Alyona's hidden wealth and her cruel treatment of her half-sister Lizaveta. The words wormed their way into Raskolnikov's mind, taking root and growing into a monstrous plan. In the days that followed, Raskolnikov's thoughts twisted and turned like a labyrinth of madness. Alyona ceased to be a person in his mind, instead becoming a symbol of all that was wrong with society, a parasite feeding off the misfortune of others. The idea of murdering her, of ridding the world of her presence, became an obsession that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. With meticulous care, born of a mind teetering on the brink, Raskolnikov prepared for the unthinkable. He visited Alyona's apartment under various guises, his keen eyes mapping out every detail, every potential obstacle. In the dead of night, illuminated only by the flickering light of a candle, he crafted a fake pledge, his trembling hands betraying the enormity of what he was planning. With needle and thread, he sewed a hidden loop inside his coat, a secret compartment for the weapon he would use to commit the ultimate crime. As the fateful day approached, Raskolnikov's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He paced his tiny room like a caged animal, muttering to himself, his eyes wild and unfocused. The walls seemed to close in on him, the peeling wallpaper a silent witness to his descent into madness. His friend, Dmitry Prokofyevich Razumikin, watched with growing concern. Razumikin, a poor but hard-working student, represented everything Raskolnikov had once aspired to be. His genuine concern and unwavering friendship only served to highlight the depths to which Raskolnikov had sunk. But the chasm between them had grown too wide, and Raskolnikov pushed him away with sharp words and cold silence, retreating further into the dark recesses of his tortured mind. On the eve of his planned crime, Raskolnikov stood at his window, gazing out at the city lights that flickered like dying stars. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical force, threatening to crush him beneath its enormity. There was no turning back now. He had set himself on this path, and tomorrow he would put his theory to the ultimate test. As night fell, the city settled into an uneasy slumber, unaware of the horror that would soon unfold in its midst. Raskolnikov lay on his threadbare mattress, his mind racing with possibilities and doubts. The room seemed to pulse around him, the shadows on the walls taking on monstrous shapes that mirrored the darkness in his soul. Just as exhaustion began to claim him, a sudden noise from the hallway jolted him awake. Footsteps, different from his landlady's familiar tread, approached his door. Raskolnikov's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the handle, waiting for it to turn. Who could be seeking him out at this hour? Had his plan somehow been discovered? The footsteps stopped just outside his room. In the silence that followed, Raskolnikov could hear his own ragged breathing, loud as thunder in his ears. Then slowly, agonizingly, the door handle began to turn. Raskolnikov's eyes snapped open on the day of the murder. His mind was already racing, filled with a nervous anticipation that coursed through his veins. The grimy window of his cramped room filtered the dim light of dawn, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. He rose from his bed, his movements jerky and uncertain, like a puppet with tangled strings. His heart pounded against his rib cage, each beat a thunderous reminder of the terrible deed that lay ahead. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere sensed the weight of his intentions. With trembling hands, Raskolnikov made his way to the caretaker's shed. The rusty hinges protested loudly as he eased the door open, the sound grating against his frayed nerves. His eyes darted around nervously, searching for any sign of discovery. There, nestled among the clutter, like a sinister promise, lay the axe. It gleamed dully in the half-light, its edge hungry for what was to come. He snatched it up, the weight unfamiliar and terrifying in his grasp. Quickly he concealed it under his coat, the cold metal pressing against his skin like an icy finger of judgment. As he stumbled towards Alyona Ivanovna's apartment, doubts gnawed at him like hungry rats. His legs felt like lead, each step a monumental effort. The streets of St. Petersburg, usually teeming with life, seemed eerily quiet. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. The fake cigarette case in his pocket felt like a stone, a physical manifestation of the lie he was about to tell. His mouth was dry, tongue sticking to the roof as he rehearsed his story. Finally, he stood before Alyona's door, his heart a frantic drumbeat in his ears. His knuckles rapped out a staccato rhythm that matched his pulse as he knocked. Alyona's suspicious eyes peered at him through the crack in the door, narrowed and calculating. The musty smell of her apartment hit him like a wave as she reluctantly let him in, mingling with the acrid scent of his own fear-soaked sweat. Time seemed to slow as she turned her back to examine the worthless pledge. Raskolnikov's hand moved of its own accord, drawing the axe from beneath his coat. It arced through the air, catching the dim light before it came crashing down on Alyona's skull with a sickening thud. The first blow didn't kill her. Her agonized scream pierced the air, a sound that would haunt Raskolnikov's nightmares for years to come. Panic seized him, his vision blurring as he struck again and again, each blow more frenzied than the last, until at last she lay still. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Raskolnikov's ragged breathing. He stood there panting, his hands slick with blood that felt warm and sticky against his skin. The reality of what he'd done crashed over him like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him in horror and regret. But there was no time for remorse. With shaking hands, he began to search for the money and valuables, his movements frantic and clumsy. He found the keys to her strongbox, fumbling with them as he tried to unlock it, the metal slipping in his blood-stained grip. Just as he was rifling through Alyona's belongings, the door creaked open. Raskolnikov's blood ran cold, his heart seeming to stop in his chest as Lizaveta, Alyona's simple-minded half-sister, stepped into the room. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time stood still. Lizaveta's face contorted in confusion, then dawning horror as she took in the scene before her. Before she could scream, Raskolnikov was upon her, the axe swinging in a terrible arc. The second murder, unplanned and brutal, sent him spiraling into a frenzy of fear and confusion. His mind reeling, Raskolnikov grabbed a purse and some trinkets, his movements now fueled by pure animal instinct. The sound of approaching footsteps sent a jolt of terror through him. Other tenants, alerted by the commotion, were coming to investigate, With his heart in his throat, Raskolnikov slipped out of the apartment, narrowly avoiding detection. The stolen items felt like lead weights in his pockets as he fled down the stairs, each step echoing loudly in the stairwell. The walls seemed to close in around him, threatening to trap him in this nightmare of his own making. In a daze, he found himself in a courtyard where he hid the stolen goods under a large rock. The axe, now a damning piece of evidence, burned in his hands like a brand of guilt. He returned it to the caretaker's shed, meticulously wiping away any traces of his presence, his movements mechanical and detached. Finally, Raskolnikov stumbled back to his room, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Exhaustion overtook him, and he collapsed onto his bed, falling into a deep, troubled sleep. The room spun around him, the walls seeming to whisper accusations as consciousness slipped away. When he awoke, disorientation gripped him. The events of the day swirled in his mind, blurring the line between horrific reality and nightmare. As consciousness slowly returned, so did the crushing weight of his actions, leaving him to grapple with the monstrous deed he had committed. Raskolnikov's head throbbed, a dull ache that seemed to echo the blows of the axe. He tried to sit up, but the room tilted dangerously, sending waves of nausea through him. As he struggled to make sense of his surroundings, a terrible realization began to dawn. The line between sanity and madness, once so clear, now seemed to blur before his eyes. Was this the beginning of his descent into something far worse than the act itself? In the wake of the murders, Raskolnikov's mind began to crumble. He descended into a feverish state, teetering between moments of delirium and fleeting instants of clarity. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a lead blanket, each breath a struggle against the rising tide of guilt and fear. His small, dingy room became a prison of his own making. The peeling wallpaper seemed to whisper accusations, its faded patterns twisting into grotesque faces that mocked him. The floorboards creaked and groaned with every step, threatening to give away his terrible secret. The stale air hung heavy with the stench of sweat and desperation. With trembling hands, Raskolnikov gathered the clothes he had worn during the murders. The fabric felt heavy and damp, as if still soaked with the blood of his victims. He stumbled to the small stove in the corner, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the entire building could hear it. The flames licked at the cloth, consuming the evidence. Acrid smoke filled the room, stinging his eyes and choking his lungs, mingling with the sour taste of fear in his mouth. Paranoia gripped him like an iron vise. Every shadow held a potential witness, every footstep outside his door a harbinger of discovery. He obsessed over minute details, replaying the crime in his mind like a broken record. The stolen items, meager trinkets that now seemed to mock him with their insignificance. He hastily concealed behind a loose section of wallpaper. The constant rustle of the paper in the drafty room became a persistent reminder of his guilt, like the beating of Poe's telltale heart. Razumikin, his loyal friend, became an unwelcome intrusion into Raskolnikov's self-imposed isolation. His concerned face and gentle words only served to heighten Raskolnikov's anxiety. When Razumikin brought the doctor, Zosimov, to examine him, Raskolnikov felt as if he were being dissected under a microscope. Every question, every probing glance seemed designed to uncover his dark secret. "Leave me be," Raskolnikov snapped, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar even to his own ears. "I'm fine. I don't need your help or your pity." The words tasted bitter on his tongue, but he couldn't bear the weight of their concern. The news of his summons to the police station for questioning about an unrelated debt sent Raskolnikov into a spiral of panic. His heart raced like a trapped animal, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead. The mundane reason for the summons did little to quell his fears. In his mind, it was merely a ruse, a clever trap to ensnare him. St. Petersburg buzzed with talk of the brutal double murder. Raskolnikov found himself drawn to these conversations like a moth to a flame, both terrified and fascinated. In taverns thick with pipe smoke and the stench of cheap vodka, he listened with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity as patrons speculated wildly about the killer's identity and motives. "I heard it was a madman," one gruff voice declared. "Only a lunatic could do something so savage." "Nah," another countered. "It was too clever for a madman. This was the work of a cold, calculating mind. Each word was a dagger to Raskolnikov's psyche, driving him deeper into his own tortured thoughts. He pored over newspaper articles, his eyes burning as he scrutinized every line for any hint that the authorities might be closing in on him. The black ink seemed to swirl on the page, forming accusing faces that stared back at him. Detective Porfiry Petrovich entered the scene like a spider, carefully constructing its web. His keen eyes seemed to pierce through Raskolnikov's facade, noting every nervous tick and hesitation. Though their interactions were brief and seemingly casual, Raskolnikov felt the weight of the detective's suspicion bearing down on him like a physical force. Unable to resist the pull of his own guilt, Raskolnikov found himself drawn back to the scene of his crime. The familiar street now seemed alien and hostile. The building loomed before him like a monolithic accusation, its windows dark and accusing. Inside, workers busied themselves with renovations, erasing the physical evidence of the horrors that had occurred there. "Excuse me," Raskolnikov heard himself say, his voice sounding distant and detached. "I used to know the old woman who lived here. What exactly happened?" The workers exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Raskolnikov's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a thunderous roar in his ears. He had gone too far, asked too much. Panic clawed at his throat as he mumbled an excuse and fled, certain that his guilty conscience was written plainly across his face for all to see. As days blurred into nights, Raskolnikov's grip on reality began to slip. Nightmares plagued his fitful sleep, vivid tableaus of blood and accusation. He would wake gasping, sheets tangled around him like grasping hands trying to drag him down into the depths of his own guilt. Even in his waking hours, hallucinations danced at the edges of his vision, fleeting glimpses of his victims, their lifeless eyes boring into his soul. The line between reality and the fevered imaginings of his guilt-ridden mind grew increasingly blurred. Raskolnikov found himself adrift in a sea of paranoia and self-loathing, each wave threatening to pull him under. As he stared at his haggard reflection in a cracked mirror, he wondered if the face looking back at him was truly his own, or that of the monster he had become. The walls of his room seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick and oppressive. Raskolnikov's breath came in short, ragged gasps. He needed to escape, to find some respite from the relentless torment of his own mind. With shaking hands, he grasped the door handle, his decision made in a moment of desperate clarity. He would seek solace in the only place left to him, the numbing embrace of vodka and the anonymity of a crowded tavern. Raskolnikov pushed open the heavy wooden door of a dimly lit tavern. His eyes squinted, adjusting to the smoky haze that hung thick in the air. The stench of cheap vodka and unwashed bodies assaulted his nostrils, making him wrinkle his nose in disgust. As he scanned the room, his gaze fell upon a hunched figure at a grimy table in the corner. Semyon Zakharovich Marmeladov sat there, a disheveled mess of a man. His bloodshot eyes, watery and unfocused, betrayed his deep state of inebriation. Raskolnikov hesitated for a moment, then made his way over, drawn by a morbid curiosity. "I was once a clerk, you know," Marmeladov slurred as Raskolnikov approached. His trembling hand clutched a half-empty glass like a lifeline. "A respectable man with a family. But now," he trailed off, shame and regret clouding his features. Raskolnikov sat down, the rickety chair creaking under his weight. The tavern around them buzzed with the low murmur of desperate men drowning their sorrows. Marmeladov's words tumbled out in a torrent, each one heavy with the weight of his misery. As the former clerk spoke, Raskolnikov found himself drawn into the man's tragic tale. Marmeladov described his descent into alcoholism with brutal honesty, each word a knife twisting in his own gut. The raw pain in his voice made Raskolnikov's skin prickle with discomfort. "My Sonya," Marmeladov whispered, tears welling in his rheumy eyes. "My daughter, only 18. She had to." He couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a foul odor. Raskolnikov's stomach churned with a mixture of pity and revulsion. Unable to bear the weight of Marmeladov's confession any longer, Raskolnikov helped the drunken man to his feet. Together they stumbled through the grimy streets, Marmeladov's ramblings echoing off the cold stone walls. The chill night air did little to clear the fog of despair that seemed to cling to them both. When they reached Marmeladov's home, a squalid room that barely deserved the name, Raskolnikov came face to face with the reality of the man's words. Katerina Ivanovna, Marmeladov's wife, stood in the doorway, her gaunt face a mask of anger and despair. Behind her, wide-eyed children peered out, their hollow cheeks a silent testament to their hunger. The scene burned itself into Raskolnikov's mind, a vivid tableau of suffering that would haunt his thoughts in the days that followed. He found himself torn between compassion for their plight and disgust at the depths to which humanity could sink. Days later, fate threw Raskolnikov back into the Marmeladov's tragic orbit. As he walked along a busy street, the clatter of hooves and shouts of alarm caught his attention. There, sprawled in the road like a broken doll, lay Marmeladov. A carriage had struck him down, the wheels of fate turning cruelly once more. Despite his own dire financial straits, Raskolnikov felt compelled to help. He emptied his meager purse into Katerina Ivanovna's trembling hands, the coins feeling woefully inadequate in the face of such misfortune. The cold metal seemed to mock him, a paltry offering against the tide of poverty and despair. It was then that he first saw Sonya. She stood apart from the chaos, a figure of quiet dignity amidst the squalor. Her eyes, when they met Raskolnikov's, held a depth of sorrow and compassion that took his breath away. In that moment, a connection sparked between them, one that would prove pivotal in the days to come. The funeral was a spectacle of misery that assaulted all of Raskolnikov's senses. The acrid smell of cheap incense mixed with the sour odor of unwashed bodies. Raskolnikov watched as Katerina Ivanovna, her mind fraying at the edges, lashed out at anyone within reach. Her shrill voice rose above the muttered prayers, accusing her landlady, her neighbors, the very world itself of conspiring against her. As the chaotic scene unfolded, Raskolnikov found himself overwhelmed. The raw desperation on display forced him to confront the real-world consequences of poverty and despair. His carefully constructed philosophical justifications began to crumble in the face of such stark human suffering. The funeral descended into pandemonium, with Katerina Ivanovna at its center. Her wild eyes darted from person to person as she hurled accusations and pleas in equal measure. The other tenants, a motley crew of the downtrodden and desperate, responded with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Raskolnikov stood apart, a silent observer to the unfolding drama. As he watched the depths of the Marmeladov's social and economic despair laid bare, he felt something shift within him. The neat theories and rationalizations that had led him to this point suddenly seemed hollow, unable to withstand the onslaught of raw human misery before him. As he stumbled away from the funeral, his mind reeling from all he had witnessed, Raskolnikov was struck by a sudden, overwhelming desire to see his own family. The thought of his mother and sister, so far away in their provincial town, filled him with a longing he hadn't felt in years. Little did he know that at that very moment, a letter was making its way through the postal system, carrying news that would soon turn his world upside down. Raskolnikov's mother, Pulcheria Alexandrovna, and sister Avdotia Romanovna, known affectionately as Dunya, arrived in St. Petersburg from their provincial town. The bustling city streets, so different from their quiet home, seemed to mirror the tumultuous emotions brewing within the family reunion. The cacophony of horse-drawn carriages and street vendors' cries assaulted their senses as they made their way through the crowded thoroughfares. Pulcheria's eyes darted nervously, overwhelmed by the frenetic energy of the city, while Dunya walked with measured steps, her chin held high despite the uncertainty that gnawed at her insides. Their modest lodgings felt cramped and stuffy, the air thick with unspoken tension. Pulcheria's weathered hands trembled as she unpacked, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric of her best dress. She glanced frequently at her son, her heart aching at the sight of his gaunt face and hollow eyes. "Rodya," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we have news." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Dunya is engaged to be married." Raskolnikov's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. "Married? To whom?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Dunya stepped forward, her posture straight and proud. "Pyotr Petrovich Luzhin," she answered, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying a hint of uncertainty. He's a lawyer of some repute in Petersburg. Raskolnikov's mind raced, his thoughts a tangled web of suspicion and protective instinct. He listened as his mother explained the circumstances, her words painting a picture of financial necessity rather than romantic inclination. "It's for the best, Rodya," Porfiry insisted, her eyes pleading for understanding. "With Luzhin's position, we can secure a better future. For all of us." Each syllable felt like a weight on Raskolnikov's already burdened conscience. The pressure of his recent actions threatened to suffocate him, the walls of the small room seeming to pulse with his growing anxiety. As the conversation unfolded, Raskolnikov learned of Dunya's past employment with the Svidrigailov family. The tale of scandal involving Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov's improper advances towards Dunya unraveled like a frayed tapestry, each thread revealing a new layer of complexity. "That scoundrel," Raskolnikov muttered, his fist clenching involuntarily. The image of his sister, vulnerable and alone in a strange household, ignited a protective fury within him. His nails dug into his palms, leaving crescent-shaped marks on his skin. Dunya recounted the events with a detached calm that belied the turmoil she must have felt. "Marfa Petrovna, Svidrigailov's wife, initially blamed me," she explained, her voice steady but her eyes distant. "But later she saw the truth and apologized. She even helped arrange this engagement to Luzhin." Raskolnikov paced the room like a caged animal, the floorboards creaking under his restless steps. The stark contrast between his former self, the devoted son and brother, and his current state of inner chaos was painfully apparent. Every interaction with his family felt like navigating a minefield, simple questions about his health or studies becoming monumental challenges. A sharp knock at the door cut through the tension, announcing the arrival of Razumikin, Raskolnikov's loyal friend. His booming voice and easy manner brought a momentary respite to the charged atmosphere, like a cool breeze on a sweltering day. Razumikin's eyes lingered on Dunya, a spark of interest quickly masked by friendly concern. "I hope your journey wasn't too taxing," he said, his genuine warmth a balm to the family's frayed nerves. As the days passed, the complex dynamics between Raskolnikov, his family, and Razumikin created a delicate balance. Raskolnikov watched with a mixture of relief and jealousy as Razumikin effortlessly provided the support he himself struggled to offer. His friend's laughter and animated conversations a stark contrast to his own brooding silence. The arrival of Luzhin in St. Petersburg cast a long shadow over the family's reunion. His self-important manner and thinly veiled condescension grated on Raskolnikov's already frayed nerves, each word from the man's mouth setting his teeth on edge. "My dear Avdotya Romanovna," Luzhin said, his voice dripping with false sweetness, "I trust you find Petersburg to your liking?" Dunya's polite response was overshadowed by the storm brewing in Raskolnikov's eyes. The air crackled with tension, unspoken challenges and simmering resentments threatening to boil over at any moment. As Luzhin continued to speak, extolling his own virtues and the benefits of the match, Raskolnikov felt a plan forming in the depths of his troubled mind. His eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint appearing as he studied the man who presumed to claim his sister's hand. With each passing moment, his resolve strengthened. He would not allow this farce to continue. He would expose Luzhin for what he truly was, no matter the cost. Raskolnikov harbored a deep conviction that Luzhin was unworthy of his sister. This belief drove him to devise a plan that would expose Luzhin's true nature. The cramped, dimly lit room seemed to close in on Raskolnikov as he waited for his guest to arrive. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The floorboards creaked ominously, announcing their approach. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation to come. The door swung open, and in filed Dunya, their mother and Luzhin. The air in the room instantly became charged with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. Raskolnikov's eyes darted between them, finally settling on Luzhin. The man stood tall, his chin lifted in an expression of smug superiority that made Raskolnikov's blood boil. As the conversation began, Raskolnikov's words tumbled out in a rush, like a dam breaking. "You've been trying to isolate Dunya from us," he accused, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Your insistence on a modest wedding, your reluctance to support our mother financially, it all points to your true nature, Luzhin." The room fell silent, save for the sharp intake of breath from Pulcheria Alexandrovna. Dunya's eyes widened, her gaze flicking between her brother and her fiancé, as if trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the one being unmasked before her. Luzhin's face contorted, his mask of civility slipping to reveal the ugly truth beneath. "How dare you?" he sputtered, his cheeks flushing an angry red. "You know nothing of my intentions or my character." But Raskolnikov was relentless, like a hound that had caught the scent of its prey. He laid bare Luzhin's miserly behavior, his words painting a vivid picture of a man consumed by selfishness and pride. With each revelation, Dunya's expression shifted, her initial shock giving way to a dawning realization. The heated argument that ensued was like a storm, with accusations flying like lightning bolts and tempers flaring like thunder. Luzhin's true colors emerged, his pride and selfishness on full display for all to see. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the man behind the carefully constructed facade. In the eye of this emotional tempest, Dunya stood, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Enough," she said, her tone firm despite the slight tremor in her hands. "I've seen and heard enough. The engagement is off, Luzhin." The silence that followed was deafening. Luzhin's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Without another word, he stormed out, the door slamming behind him with a finality that echoed through the small room. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the air seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Pulcheria Alexandrovna sank into a chair, her face a mask of distress. The loss of financial security weighed heavily on her, visible in the slump of her shoulders and the worry lines etched deep into her forehead. Dunya, torn between gratitude and concern, approached Raskolnikov. Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to reconcile this passionate defender with the brother she knew. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "But Rodya, your behavior, it worries me." Raskolnikov's triumph was short-lived, the weight of his actions settling on him like a heavy cloak. He paced the room, his movements erratic, his eyes darting about as if seeking an escape from the very walls that surrounded him. The toll of his crime, hidden from view but ever present, seemed to seep into his very being, manifesting in his increasingly unstable behavior. Razumikin, who had been a silent observer throughout the confrontation, now stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern as he watched his friend's agitated movements. There was something in Raskolnikov's eyes, a haunted look that spoke of deeper troubles than just family drama. Suspicion began to take root in Razumikin's mind, a nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong with his friend. As the tension in the room slowly dissipated, Razumikin found his gaze drawn to Dunya. Her strength and character in the face of such turmoil impressed him deeply. A warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but one that added yet another layer of complexity to the already tangled web of relationships. The chapter of their lives that had closed with Luzhin's departure left them all changed. As night fell over St. Petersburg, casting long shadows across the room, Raskolnikov's behavior grew increasingly erratic. His pacing became more frenzied, his muttering more incoherent. The concern in the eyes of his family and friends deepened, a silent acknowledgement that while one crisis had been averted, another, perhaps more dire, was just beginning to unfold. As Raskolnikov stumbled toward the door, his mind reeling from the events of the day, a sudden chill ran down his spine. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, the air growing thick and oppressive. He gasped for breath, his hand fumbling for the doorknob. As he wrenched the door open, the city beyond loomed before him, a maze of dark alleys and sinister shadows. Something in the depths of his tortured mind whispered that his true ordeal was only just beginning. The city's oppressive atmosphere mirrored Raskolnikov's inner turmoil. Shadows danced on grimy walls, and the air hung thick with the stench of poverty and despair. As he approached Sonya's building, each step felt like a battle against his own guilt. Raskolnikov's hand trembled as he knocked on Sonya's door. The sound echoed in the narrow hallway, seeming to reverberate through his very bones. When Sonya opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "Raskolnikov," she whispered, stepping aside to let him in. The small room was bathed in the warm glow of a single candle, its flame dancing erratically, casting long shadows on the bare walls. The space felt intimate, almost claustrophobic, amplifying the tension between them. Raskolnikov's gaze darted around the room, unable to settle. His fingers twitched nervously at his sides. "Sonya," he began, his voice barely audible, "I need to understand. How do you keep your faith in this world of suffering?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. Sonya's fingers twisted in her lap, her brow furrowed in thought. "It's not easy," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "But faith gives me strength when nothing else can." Her words seemed to ignite something in Raskolnikov. He began to pace the small room, his movements jerky and agitated, like a caged animal. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, each sound a jarring reminder of his restlessness. Suddenly he whirled to face Sonya. "Read to me," he demanded, his voice urgent and raw. "The story of Lazarus. I need to hear it." Sonya hesitated for a moment, startled by his intensity. Then with gentle hands she reached for her worn Bible. As she began to read, her voice grew stronger, filling the room with ancient words of resurrection and redemption. Raskolnikov listened intently, his eyes closed, his body taut with tension. The story of Lazarus struck a chord deep within him, resonating with his desperate desire for a second chance, for a way to rise from the grave of his actions. As Sonya's voice faded, the silence that followed was electric. Raskolnikov's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a thunderous reminder of the life he had taken. The words tumbled from his lips before he could stop them, like water breaking through a dam. "I killed her," he confessed, his voice cracking. "I killed the old pawnbroker and her sister." Sonya's gasp cut through the air like a knife. Horror and disbelief warred on her face, her hand flying to her mouth as if to hold back a scream. The candle flickered violently, as if recoiling from the weight of his confession. But Raskolnikov couldn't stop now. The floodgates had opened, and everything poured out. His theory of extraordinary men, his reasons, the sickening details of the murders. With each word he felt both lighter and heavier, the burden of his secret lifting even as the full weight of his actions settled on his shoulders. Sonya listened, her face a canvas of emotions. Shock, revulsion, pity, and something else. Something that looked almost like understanding. When he finally fell silent, spent and trembling, she reached out and took his hand. Her touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold sweat that had broken out on his skin. "You must confess," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's the only way to find peace, to seek redemption." Raskolnikov recoiled, pulling his hand away as if burned. "How can I?" he cried, his voice raw with desperation. "They'll send me to Siberia." "Then I'll go with you," Sonya declared, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. "Wherever you go, whatever happens, I'll be there." Her words pierced through the fog of guilt and fear that had clouded Raskolnikov's mind. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a glimmer of hope, like a tiny flame flickering in the darkness. Sonya reached for something around her neck, and with trembling fingers, removed a small cross. She held it out to Raskolnikov, the simple wooden symbol seeming to glow in the dim light. "Take it," she urged. "Let it remind you that there's always a path to redemption, no matter how dark the night." As Raskolnikov's fingers closed around the cross, he felt something shift inside him. It was as if a great weight had been lifted, replaced by a different kind of burden. The weight of choice, of responsibility, of the long and difficult road ahead. He left Sonya's lodgings that night feeling both relieved and conflicted. The cool night air on his face was a stark contrast to the warmth of Sonya's room, mirroring the tumultuous mix of emotions swirling within him. Her unwavering support and the weight of his confession created a complex tapestry of feelings that he knew would take time to unravel. As he walked into the darkness, the small cross pressed against his palm, a constant reminder of the choice that lay before him and the long journey to redemption that awaited. The streets of St. Petersburg seemed different now, charged with a new energy, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. Just as Raskolnikov turned the corner towards his own lodgings, a figure emerged from the shadows. The street lamp caught the man's face for a brief moment, and Raskolnikov's blood ran cold. He knew that face, those piercing eyes that seemed to see right through him. Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov had arrived in St. Petersburg, and with him came a sense of impending doom that threatened to shatter the fragile hope Raskolnikov had just begun to nurture. Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov arrived in St. Petersburg, his presence casting a long shadow over the city. As Dunya's former employer, his appearance added a new layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. The damp, chilly air of St. Petersburg clung to Svidrigailov like a second skin as he prowled the bustling streets. His eyes, sharp and predatory, darted from face to face, searching for one in particular. The cobblestones echoed his footsteps, each sound a heartbeat in the city's vast circulatory system. When Svidrigailov finally crossed paths with Raskolnikov, the air seemed to crackle with tension. A knowing smirk played on Svidrigailov's lips as he purred, "Ah, Rodion Romanovich, I believe we have much to discuss." His voice was smooth as silk, but it carried an undercurrent of danger that made Raskolnikov's skin crawl. Leaning in close, Svidrigailov's hot breath ghosted over Raskolnikov's ear. "I know what you did," he whispered, the words hanging between them like a guillotine blade. "I overheard your confession to that sweet Sonya." Raskolnikov's blood turned to ice in his veins. His heart pounded so loudly, he was sure Svidrigailov could hear it. As they walked together through the winding streets, the older man began to unravel the tangled web of his own past. Each revelation was like a dagger twisting in Raskolnikov's gut. Svidrigailov spoke of murders that stained his hands, his words painting pictures of violence that danced in the air between them. The suspicious circumstances surrounding his wife's death hung over the conversation like a dark cloud. With each word, Raskolnikov felt the weight of his own actions pressing down upon him, threatening to crush him beneath their burden. Fear for Dunya gnawed at Raskolnikov's insides. In his mind's eye, he saw his sister, pure and innocent, a fragile bird in the presence of this circling hawk. Svidrigailov's intentions, shrouded in mystery, loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. Their conversation meandered through the murky waters of morality and the afterlife. Svidrigailov's nihilistic views clashed violently with Raskolnikov's internal struggle. "What is right and wrong?" Svidrigailov mused, his eyes glinting dangerously in the dim light. But constructs of a society too weak to embrace true freedom? With the skill of a master manipulator, Svidrigailov began to weave his web. "I could help you, you know," he offered, false sincerity dripping from every word. "All I ask in return is access to your dear sister." The very thought made Raskolnikov's stomach churn. Before he could respond, Svidrigailov continued, "I've left my fortune to my young fiancée, and I've set aside money for Sonya's siblings. I'm not all bad, you see." But even as he spoke of kindness, there was a glint in his eye that betrayed his true nature. As days passed, Svidrigailov's obsession with Dunya became increasingly apparent. He lurked in shadows, appearing unexpectedly like a ghost materializing from the mist. His presence was a constant threat, unspoken but ever present. One evening, as Dunya hurried home, the click of her heels on the cobblestones echoing in the empty street, a figure stepped out from an alleyway. Svidrigailov stood before her, his smile a mixture of charm and menace. "My dear Dunya," he said, his voice soft but laced with danger. "How fortunate we should meet like this." Dunya's heart raced, her eyes darting for an escape route. Svidrigailov's words, though polite on the surface, carried veiled threats that chilled her to the bone. As she finally broke away, hurrying towards the safety of home, Svidrigailov's gaze followed her, his obsession growing with each passing moment. For Raskolnikov, already teetering on the edge of sanity, Svidrigailov's presence was like a constant, gnawing ache. The threat to Dunya, the exposure of his own crime, and the moral quagmire presented by Svidrigailov's philosophy all combined to push him further into the abyss of his own tortured psyche. As night fell over St. Petersburg, the city seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with tension, the streets eerily quiet. Raskolnikov found himself standing before an imposing building, its weathered brick facade looming over him like a silent judge. His heart hammered against his ribs, a caged bird desperate for freedom. With trembling hands, he reached for the door of the police station, knowing that once he stepped inside, nothing would ever be the same again. The police station loomed before Raskolnikov, its weathered brick facade a silent sentinel of justice. He paused at the entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making each step forward a Herculean effort. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door, the musty smell of old paper and stale coffee assaulted his nostrils. The cramped interior buzzed with the low murmur of voices and the occasional sharp bark of laughter. Raskolnikov's eyes darted nervously around the room, seeking out the one face he both longed for and dreaded to see. There, behind a desk cluttered with files and half-empty coffee cups, sat Detective Porfiry Petrovich. Their eyes met across the room, and Raskolnikov felt a jolt of electricity course through his body. Porfiry's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a predator's grin that sent a chill down Raskolnikov's spine. "Ah, Rodion Romanovich!" Porfiry's voice cut through the background noise like a knife. "What a pleasant surprise. I've been hoping to speak with you." Raskolnikov's mouth went dry, his tongue feeling like sandpaper as he struggled to form words. I've come to recover a pawned watch," he managed to stammer out. Porfiry's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement or triumph. Of course. But while you're here, why don't we have a little chat? I found your article on crime quite fascinating." The room seemed to shrink around them as Porfiry led Raskolnikov to a small, windowless office. The walls pressed in, the air growing thick and oppressive. Raskolnikov's palms began to sweat as he lowered himself into a hard wooden chair across from the detective. What followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Porfiry's tactics were as varied as they were unsettling. One moment, he would hurl thinly veiled accusations, his voice rising to a crescendo that made Raskolnikov flinch. The next, he would dismiss his own words with a casual wave of his hand, leaving Raskolnikov reeling from the emotional whiplash. "You know, Rodion Romanovich," Porfiry mused, leaning back in his chair. "It's fascinating how your article seems to mirror the recent murders, almost as if you had inside knowledge." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Raskolnikov's throat constricted, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat like thorns. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Each encounter with Porfiry left Raskolnikov more shaken than the last. His once sharp mind felt dull, his thoughts sluggish and muddied. He found himself jumping at shadows, seeing accusation in every glance thrown his way. The introduction of Nikolai, a workman claiming to have seen Raskolnikov at the crime scene, was the final straw. It was as if Porfiry had conjured a ghost from thin air, a specter of guilt made flesh. Raskolnikov's carefully constructed defenses began to crumble like a sandcastle before the rising tide. In their final encounter, Porfiry laid out his theory of the crime with chilling precision. His words painted a picture so vivid, so accurate, that Raskolnikov felt as if he were reliving the murders in that very moment. "You see," Porfiry explained, his voice barely above a whisper, "the killer wasn't just after money. No, he was testing a theory about extraordinary men and their right to transgress moral boundaries." "Sound familiar, Rodion Romanovich?" Raskolnikov's denial came automatically, a reflex born of desperation. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang hollow. The weight of his actions, the lives he had taken, pressed down on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. As he stumbled out of the police station for the last time, Raskolnikov felt as if he had aged a lifetime in mere days. His steps were unsteady, his vision blurred. He was a man on the precipice, teetering between confession and continued denial, between redemption and damnation. The streets of St. Petersburg stretched out before him, familiar yet suddenly alien. As night fell, a thick, oppressive fog began to roll in from the river, shrouding the city in an eerie, ghostly pall. Raskolnikov pulled his coat tighter around himself, shivering not from the cold, but from the realization that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around him. The streets of St. Petersburg were shrouded in a thick, oppressive fog. Svidrigailov made his way through this murky veil towards his lodgings. his mind racing with the possibilities that Raskolnikov's secret presented. The damp air clung to his skin, mirroring the sticky web of intrigue he was weaving. Each footstep echoed off the cobblestones, a rhythmic reminder of his calculated plan. With the precision of a spider luring its prey, Svidrigailov set his trap for Dunya. The bait? Information about her brother. As Dunya stepped into his dimly lit room, the floorboards creaked under her feet. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear, darted around the space. "My dear Dunya," Svidrigailov purred, his voice smooth as silk but laced with venom. "I'm afraid I have some rather distressing news about your brother." Dunya's breath hitched. "What is it? What's happened to Rodya?" Her voice trembled, betraying her composure. Svidrigailov's lips curled into a cruel smile. "It's not what's happened to him, my dear. It's what he's done." With agonizing slowness, he unraveled the truth of Raskolnikov's crime. Each word was a hammer blow, shattering Dunya's world. The color drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the fog outside. "But fear not," Svidrigailov continued, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "I can save your brother. For a price." The air grew thick with tension, almost suffocating. Svidrigailov laid out his proposition, each word dripping with unspoken threat. Dunya listened, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Never," she spat, her voice quivering with disgust and fury. "I would rather die than submit to your vile demands." Svidrigailov's mask of civility slipped, revealing the monster beneath. As Dunya turned to leave, he moved with startling speed, blocking her path. The room suddenly felt smaller, closing in around them. "You misunderstand, my dear," he growled. "This isn't a request." What followed was a heart-stopping confrontation. Dunya's hand trembled as she produced a revolver. The small room exploded with the crack of a gunshot. The bullet whistled past Svidrigailov, embedding itself in the wall with a dull thud. Time stood still. Svidrigailov looked at Dunya, really looked at her. He saw not just her physical beauty, but the fire in her spirit. In that instant, the futility of his desires crashed over him like a wave. With a heavy sigh, he stepped aside. Dunya fled, her footsteps fading rapidly down the stairs. Svidrigailov was left alone with the weight of his actions. The emptiness of his life, the impossibility of redemption. It all converged on him at once. The walls seemed to close in, pushing him out into the night. St. Petersburg at night was a different world. The fog had thickened, turning familiar streets into a labyrinth of shadows. As Svidrigailov wandered, his mind began to play tricks on him. Or perhaps it was his conscience, finally making itself heard. Out of the mist, faces appeared. His late wife, her eyes accusing, her lips moving in silent condemnation. A young girl, her innocence forever tainted by his actions, reached out with ghostly hands. These specters of his past crimes haunted his every step, driving him further into the depths of despair. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Svidrigailov found himself in a public square. A young soldier stood nearby, alert despite the early hour. With a calmness that belied his inner turmoil, Svidrigailov approached the soldier and borrowed his revolver. The cold metal felt heavy in his hand, a fitting end to a life weighted down by sin. Without hesitation, Svidrigailov raised the gun to his head. The sound of the shot echoed through the square, marking the end of Svidrigailov's morally bankrupt existence. As the city began to stir, news of Svidrigailov's suicide spread like wildfire. It reached Raskolnikov's ears, adding yet another layer of complexity to his already troubled state of mind. The ripples of Svidrigailov's final act would continue to be felt, a stark reminder of the consequences of one's choices in this intricate web of crime and punishment. Raskolnikov stumbled out into the street, his mind reeling from the news. The weight of his own guilt, coupled with the shock of Svidrigailov's death, threatened to crush him. As he looked up, the streets of St. Petersburg stretched before him like a labyrinth of his own torment, each turn promising either salvation or damnation. Which path would he choose? The streets of St. Petersburg stretched before Raskolnikov like a labyrinth of his own torment. Each cobblestone seemed to whisper accusations as he wandered aimlessly, his mind a whirlpool of dark thoughts. The weight of his crime pressed down on him, making every step a struggle. The once familiar city now felt alien and hostile, its grand facades looming over him like silent judges. The Neva River caught his eye, its murky waters churning beneath the gray sky. For a moment, Raskolnikov felt an overwhelming urge to throw himself into its depths, to let the current wash away his sins. But something held him back. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or the last remnants of his will to live. With leaden feet, he made his way to his mother's home. The scent of her cooking wafted through the air, a bittersweet reminder of the life he had shattered. As he approached the door, his heart raced, and his palms grew slick with sweat. Would she see the change in him? Could a mother's love pierce through the darkness that now shrouded his soul? The moment she opened the door, her arms enveloped him in a warm embrace. The familiar smell of her perfume mixed with the aroma of fresh bread, and for a brief instant, Raskolnikov felt like a child again, safe, loved, innocent. But the feeling quickly faded as guilt gnawed at his insides. "Rodya, my dear boy," his mother said, her voice thick with concern. "You look so pale. Are you eating enough?" He forced a smile, the muscles in his face straining with the effort. "I'm fine, Mother. Just tired from my studies." Her worried eyes searched his face, and Raskolnikov felt exposed, as if she could see right through to his tainted soul. He quickly made an excuse to leave, unable to bear the weight of her love and worry any longer. The street seemed even more oppressive as he made his way to Dunya's apartment. Each step brought him closer to a conversation he dreaded, but knew was necessary. The truth burned in his throat, desperate to be released. Dunya's face lit up when she saw him, but her smile quickly faded as she took in his haggard appearance. "Rodya, what's wrong? You look terrible." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, a torrent of confession and self-loathing. He watched as shock bloomed across his sister's face like a bruise, her eyes widening in disbelief. But beneath the horror, he saw something that threatened to break him entirely, an unwavering love that persisted despite the magnitude of his crime. Leaving Dunya's apartment, Raskolnikov felt both lighter and heavier. The secret was out, but the burden of its consequences now weighed on him more than ever. His feet carried him, almost of their own accord, to Sonya's door. The small room was dimly lit, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sonya's presence was like a balm to his tortured soul, her quiet faith a beacon in his storm of doubt. As she began to read the story of Lazarus, her soft voice filled the room, each word seeming to resonate with a power beyond mere sound. The tale of rebirth and redemption echoed in the chambers of Raskolnikov's heart, igniting a spark of hope he thought long extinguished. Could he, like Lazarus, rise from the grave of his sins? The possibility, however faint, stirred something within him. With trembling hands, Sonya placed a cross around his neck. The cool metal against his skin felt both foreign and familiar, a physical reminder of the path that lay before him. As he left her presence, the cross seemed to pulse with each step, urging him forward. The police station loomed ahead, a monolithic structure that held both his doom and his salvation. Raskolnikov's legs felt weak as he climbed the steps, each one bringing him closer to a reckoning he both feared and craved. The familiar face of Ilya Petrovich, the police official he had once antagonized, greeted him with surprise and suspicion. Taking a deep breath, Raskolnikov steadied himself. The words he had rehearsed in his mind countless times now seemed to stick in his throat. But there was no turning back. "I killed them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Alyona Ivanovna and Lizaveta. It was me." The confession hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Time seemed to stand still as the reality of his admission settled over the room. Raskolnikov felt a curious mix of emotions wash over him. Relief, like a cool balm, soothed the burning ache of his secret. Yet trepidation coiled in his stomach, a serpent reminding him of the long and arduous journey that lay ahead. In that moment, standing before the shocked faces of the police, Raskolnikov understood that this was not an end, but a beginning. The path to redemption stretched before him, daunting and uncertain. But as he fingered the cross at his neck, he felt a flicker of strength. Whatever trials awaited him, he would face them. For in confessing his crime, he had taken the first step towards reclaiming his humanity. As he was led away to a holding cell, the gravity of his situation began to sink in. The cold iron bars closed behind him with a resounding clang, echoing through the empty corridor. Raskolnikov sat on the hard bench, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. Would he be sentenced to death? Or would he face a lifetime of hard labor in Siberia? The night passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity. As the first light of dawn crept through the small window of his cell, Raskolnikov heard the sound of footsteps approaching. His heart pounded in his chest as the door opened, revealing a stern-faced guard. "It's time," the guard said gruffly. "The judge is ready to see you." Raskolnikov rose on shaky legs, his mouth dry with fear. As he was led down the corridor towards the courtroom, he couldn't help but wonder. What fate awaited him behind those heavy wooden doors? The gavel fell with a resounding thud, echoing through the hushed courtroom. Raskolnikov's fate was sealed as the judge pronounced his sentence: 8 years in a Siberian prison camp. A cold shiver ran down Raskolnikov's spine as the reality of his punishment sank in. The courtroom blurred around him, faces melting into a sea of judgment and pity. His heart raced, each beat a reminder of the life he was leaving behind. In the days before his departure, Raskolnikov sought out his family. The weight of his crimes hung heavy on his shoulders as he faced them, his eyes filled with a vulnerability he'd never shown before. When he turned to Sonya, his voice was barely above a whisper, cracking with emotion. Will you come with me to Siberia?" Sonya's eyes welled with tears, her love for Raskolnikov shining through despite everything. Without hesitation, she nodded, her voice steady and sure. "Of course. I'll follow you anywhere." Her words were a lifeline, a promise of hope in the darkness that stretched before him. The journey to Siberia was long and grueling. As they traveled, the landscape transformed, growing bleaker with each passing mile. Lush forests gave way to barren plains, and finally to the harsh, unforgiving tundra. The air grew colder, biting at exposed skin and seeping into bones. Sonya settled in a nearby town, her small room a beacon of warmth in the harsh environment. The walls were thin, barely keeping out the howling wind, but to Raskolnikov it was a sanctuary. The prison camp loomed before him, a maze of gray buildings and barbed wire fences stretching as far as the eye could see. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and despair, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. As Raskolnikov stepped into his new life, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force, threatening to crush him. Days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months. The monotony of prison life was broken only by the backbreaking labor and the constant struggle for survival. Raskolnikov found himself isolated, a pariah among the other prisoners. They eyed him with suspicion and contempt, their whispers following him like shadows. "Look at him, thinks he's better than us," they'd mutter, their words cutting like knives. "Atheist, murderer." Raskolnikov's pride kept him from reaching out, building walls around himself as sturdy as those that imprisoned him. Sonya's visits were like glimpses of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She would arrive, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes bright with love and concern. "I've written to Dunya and your mother," she would say, pressing letters into his hands. "They send their love." Her touch, even through the thick fabric of his prison uniform, sent warmth spreading through his body. As the seasons changed, so too did Raskolnikov. The back-breaking labor and harsh conditions began to chip away at his defenses. He found himself watching his fellow prisoners, noticing the small acts of kindness that passed between them, a shared crust of bread, a comforting word in the dead of night. One particularly brutal winter, Raskolnikov fell ill. The fever raged through his body, leaving him weak and delirious. In the haze of his illness, a vivid dream took hold. He saw a world infected by tiny creatures, each carrying its own brand of madness. The dream was terrifying, yet strangely beautiful, like a distorted reflection of his own journey. As he recovered, something shifted within him. The world seemed different, as if he was seeing it through new eyes. He began to notice the beauty in small things, the way the sun glinted off the snow, the sound of laughter echoing across the yard. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a world he'd never truly seen before. Slowly, tentatively, Raskolnikov began to reach out to his fellow prisoners. At first they were wary, eyeing him with suspicion, but as time passed, barriers began to crumble. He found himself sharing stories over meager meals, offering a helping hand during grueling work shifts. The simple act of connection, once so foreign to him, became a lifeline. Through it all, Sonya remained a constant presence, her love unwavering. Raskolnikov found himself looking forward to her visits with an intensity that surprised him. Her smile, her gentle touch, they became anchors in the storm of his transformation. In her eyes, he saw not the murderer he had been, but the man he could become. As his sentence progressed, Raskolnikov felt a change taking root deep within him. The anger and bitterness that had driven him to commit his crime began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of empathy and connection. He started to see the humanity in those around him, recognizing the shared struggle that bound them all together. In the simple acts of kindness he had once dismissed, Raskolnikov began to find meaning. A shared smile, a word of encouragement. These small gestures took on a profound significance. As he opened himself up to the world around him, he felt the first stirrings of hope for a life beyond his crime, a chance at redemption he had never thought possible. The harsh Siberian landscape, once a symbol of his punishment, became a canvas for his transformation. The endless expanse of snow, the stark beauty of the frozen tundra. They mirrored the blank slate of his soul, ready to be rewritten. As his sentence drew to a close, Raskolnikov stood at the threshold of a new life. The man who had entered the prison camp, consumed by guilt and pride, was not the same man who would leave it. He had been broken down and rebuilt, forged in the crucible of his punishment into something new. With Sonya by his side, her hand warm in his, Raskolnikov took his first steps into freedom. The world stretched out before them, full of possibility, and for the first time in years, Raskolnikov felt the weight of his past lift, replaced by the lightness of hope. The story of his crime would always be a part of him, a scar on his soul. But as he walked away from the prison camp, hand in hand with Sonya, Raskolnikov knew that it was no longer the whole of who he was. He had found something greater than his guilt, something that would guide him through the rest of his days, the power of love, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit.
This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.